Hello there. My apologies, I can't be with you in person today, but thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and contribute to this discussion. My name's Tim Wright. I'm a co-director and co-founder of a management consultancy called Twin Tangibles. We're based in Glasgow. We specialise in the crowd economy. We have advised the OECD, European Commission, many platforms. We have provided support to the Scottish Government and consultancy to the Consob and many other organisations in the area of crowdfunding. I've been asked to speak to you about the regulatory environment of crowdfunding and alternative finance, particularly within the UK, and in the context of the recent report released by the FCA summarising their review of the situation following the introduction of their regulations earlier. I guess the reason I've been asked is I am quite vocal on this topic, and I have written and spoken about this issue. I think I should start from the position of pointing out that I am not anti-regulation. What I have an issue with is poor regulation and badly framed regulation. And whilst much of this will come across as a criticism of the FCA, I should point out that I have considerable sympathy for the FCA. I think they're in a difficult position, but I don't think they have handled it well. And as the body concerned with the regulation of this particular sector, if I am critical of that sector's regulation, inevitably it will be come across in the form of a criticism of the FCA. But I'd point out that they're not alone in an institution struggling to cope with the changes and challenges and opportunities that are presented through this type of disruptive change. By way of example, I've recently been having a conversation with HMRC, who have come in for a considerable criticism in the last few weeks, as I'm sure you're very well aware. And this was in the context of the MOS-VAT regulation changes and its impact on crowdfunding. And my conversation with HMRC was, will this be applicable to crowdfunding? And the response from HMRC was, what is crowdfunding? Having explained to them what crowdfunding is, which I did not receive a fee for, but I was happy to oblige, we've established that it does apply to crowdfunding, and the end result of this, of course, is that there are many people currently running crowdfunding campaigns putting themselves in considerable tax peril unknowingly. And it's again, one of those laws of unintended consequences. And my fear, particularly to bring us back to the FCA, is that the FCA's approach to regulation is far from reducing risk for investors and making this a safer place for people to participate in. I believe that they are bringing in systemic risk into crowdfunding. They are making this a more risky environment through having poorly formed and badly framed regulation. So they are actually undermining what they are setting out to do. So let me explore that a little bit further. I have three fundamental criticisms of the FCA. And I'll start with the first one. It is really their kind of institutional approach to this whole issue. They have undertaken two recent consultation processes, and I would put those words in inverted commas because I think they're consultations in name only. The first being a consultation concerned with responses and contributions to the introduction of additional regulations which were specific to the crowd and alternative finance sector. That consultation process invited responses. I and many others did respond, not least asking for an evidence base as to the justification for introducing additional regulations, because there was a regulatory framework in place, and the equity-based crowdfunding platforms in particular were responding to that and seeking a regulatory approval and compliance with that. So that was one of the primary responses, but there are a number of other things that were put back to them, and no cases did I or anybody else that I know that responded to this consultation process receive any sort of response. And none of the subsequent publications and pronouncements from the FCA seemed to address any of the primary issues that were brought to their attention. So this was not actually a consultation process as far as I am concerned. It was merely, well, let's be frank about it, it was window dressing. There was no intention of engaging with the people in the sector that could help frame useful and probably necessary regulatory change. So, not a consultation. And I think this somewhat high-handed approach is also exemplified in the way that they published their recent review paper. The paper was, in my opinion, poorly written. It was very casual. It was not well researched or referenced. It was anecdotal. It was not specific in its criticisms. And the end result was that the financial press, notably the FT, Wall Street Journal, and numerous other publications, took a view that this included coded language and came out with pronouncements which were pretty damning towards the alternative finance sector and crowdfunding in particular, and almost setting out that nobody should get involved with this because the regulator thinks that it's massively full of risk and potential fraud. Now, the FCA did not say that, as far as I'm concerned. The report does not say that, but I think the casual nature and the poorly structured report itself gave out those messages, and the media reported them. Now, I know that many of the platforms were unhappy with that because it seemed to misrepresent the position, and I imagine the FCA were not particularly pleased themselves. But it's that rather casual and high-handed approach that seems to permeate everything that they do. I have had numerous conversations with the FCA, and I take a view, and this is my second main criticism of the FCA, is that they do not understand crowdfunding and how alternative finance and crowdfunding in particular are distinctive from traditional financial investment models. Now, there's nothing wrong with not understanding. There's plenty of people that don't. Nevertheless, I think it is incumbent upon a regulator that's being required to look at this particular sector to at least have the humility to accept that they don't understand it and to get themselves up to speed. But I've detected no willingness to engage with people in the sector, be it myself or others, to actually address this shortfall in understanding the philosophical underpinnings that make crowdfunding distinctive. The end result is the regulatory framework that they're putting in place and some of the things that they are considering and putting forward in their consultation process are actually things that will introduce a systemic risk into crowdfunding in particular. Let me explain that a little bit further. Crowdfunding is different in what it brings to the people that are receiving that investment. It is new funding, it is money that is disintermediated, it is involving more people directly into the investment process. It is by definition bringing greater diversity, different expectations of return. It's more patient. It brings many, many benefits over and above just the finance into those that receive the money. It is integrating investors and the entrepreneurial and business environment more closely with society more widely. And so, in my estimation, it is a extremely good thing, but it also represents quite a marked departure from our traditional investment models. It also mitigates and handles risk in a completely different way to traditional investment models. It's philosophically different, but it has much in common with many of the digital disruptions that we've noticed in retail and publishing and many other sectors. This is no different. One of the key aspects of this is it's founded in what we would refer to as atomization, which is splitting up the individual transactions into many tiny transactions, and that the distribution model that characterizes that was commonly referred to as the long tail. It is also founded in the idea that there is, unlike many of the traditional investment models, there is not an asymmetry of access to information. There is ubiquitous access to information, and the crowd itself undertakes a great deal of the due diligence process in the transactions. Anything that changes the nature of that atomized distribution of investment, or anything that reduces the ability of the crowd to participate in the diligence process, fundamentally challenges the philosophical risk mitigation processes that are involved with effectively running crowdfunding. Similarly, anything that turns this into a more traditional form of investment, and it makes it perceived to be as a traditional form of investment, reduces those involved with different expectations of return. It changes their perception. Now, my view is that all of the actions of the FCA's approach to the regulation of the use of social media and their approach to managing the interactions that investors have in a crowdfunding environment, and how they actually engage in investment in crowdfunding, have all mitigated it, A, against atomization, B, against transparency, and C, they are skewing the perception of this as not an alternative investment, but just an extension of an existing financial investment model. And we're seeing, as a result of that, a flow of institutional money onto the platforms. That in itself is raising and increasing the size of the average investment, which is bringing in systemic risk. But anything that reduces the crowd's ability to undertake due diligence by constraining either participation or communication through social media will increase risk. We know that the crowd is very good at identifying risk and identifying attempts for fraud. Plenty of evidence to support that. And so the actions of the FCA in that area are again introducing risk. But one of the areas that I think is quite telling is that we are being told that as unsophisticated investors, which is a very loaded phrase in many people's estimation, are only permitted to engage in investment of 10% of their portfolio without taking advice. Two things. That does not actually play to the atomization model. I can still take 10% of my investable portfolio and invest it in one single investment. So in actual fact, it's not mitigating my risk in any way, shape or form. And I can actually get involved with this to a larger extent if I take advice from a financial advisor. Now, I don't wish to traduce the entire financial advisory industry, but I have yet to tell you that I have yet to meet a financial advisor in the traditional sense that actually understands crowdfunding in any way, shape or form. And let's not forget that these were the same financial advisors who were advising us prior to 2007 with the tremendous results that we've seen as a result of that. So all in all, I think we have a number of significant issues here, and I don't think we should be complacent about the fact that the UK's regulatory environment and its existing crowdfunding industry is very, very perceived as being tremendously successful across the world. Comparisons are not always helpful. I would agree that the UK is currently leading the world. It is highly innovative, and of course any regulations have a tendency to constrain innovation because they define the art of the possible, and we have got this far through the wonderful common law system that we have here and our ability to actually find paths through the regulations to satisfy requirements without introducing new ones. So anything that starts to set out the bounds of possibility will constrain innovation in the sector. And if we think that regulations don't have an impact on on the sector, have a look at what's happening in Germany at the moment, where the proposed regulations there are having a very, very negative impact on what was quite a thriving alternative finance marketplace. And also comparisons, the fact that there are plenty of other countries in the world with terrible democracy records should never lead us to not examine our ability to maintain and sustain our own democratic principles. So comparisons are not always a useful thing. So in conclusion, what I would like to do is draw upon some words from Professor Muhammad Yunus, who is the founding father of microcredit, and probably the man that has done more in his lifetime to address the pressing needs of the cripplingly poor in the developing world by championing the introduction of microcredit as a new and novel finance mechanism. He's a man that knows a lot about finance. He's a man that knows a lot about economics. And he knows about regulation as well. And speaking about how regulatory changes within Bangladesh enabled the introduction and the growth of microcredit, he also recognized that it requires a different philosophy in order to engage with. And I'm going to quote him specifically. He says, "You cannot create the bank of the poor with the same architecture as the bank of the rich," which is an acknowledgement that the model of microcredit is different to traditional banking, despite the fact that the Grameen Bank is called a bank. And to get things wrong will actually significantly undermine the growth of this new mechanism of finance. He went on to argue that the banking regulatory bodies are generally the wrong bodies to regulate microcredit, because again, he points out, they will not understand the philosophy and procedures of microcredit. My argument is that Professor Yunus, Nobel Prize winner, is actually exactly the same in the context of how we go about regulating the alternative and crowdfunding network. We cannot have people who are founded in traditional investment models introducing poorly framed, inappropriate regulations that do not reflect changed circumstances and different philosophies. If we do accept that, we run the risk of crushing and distorting, and most importantly, introducing additional risk into it rather than reducing it. Thanks very much for listening to me. I am happy to respond to anything that anybody wishes to bring back to me on this, and I appreciate being given the opportunity to contribute to the debate, so thank you very much.